Hey.
Cool.
All right, so we're live. It's me and Tom, Dave and Tom here. All right, Tom, how about you? You kind of kick it off, set the agenda. You're good at. You're the teacher.
Great. So the basic agenda today is that David is going to describe a schema that we can use to discuss communication in a pretty clear way. And I just want to start by pointing out that communication it's not really, there's a very common metaphor where we imagine that there's like this third party reality that we're trying to connect to together. And that's kind of what happens in our heads, but communication is really about, messaging. It's about somebody sending a message to somebody else and doing your best to make sure that they know what the heck you mean. And when you say what you mean, like there's lots of things that you could mean, and that's kind of what David is going to describe is different types of meaning. I think you described it as was it different layers of communication? Is that right?
Different levels, well, layers of communication and levels of information, and these two kind of blend together, like for lack of a better analogy, like a husband and wife, or just like a marriage in general, any partnership. Business partnership, even anything successful that partners together, communication and information is no different.
So it's 5 levels of communication.
5 levels of information. So the 5 levels of information is what? What's that?
So go ahead. Sorry, I just interrupted.
Oh, you're fine. So basically, the 5 levels of information. You're going to have, whenever you play any kind of a game, right, you're going to have a board and you're going to have rules, right? So those aren't always going to be the same. Let's call it's arbitrary, but 5 levels of information, let's call that the rules of the game. This is where the facts, the details are going to come in at. This is where the interpretations are going to be made. This is where the challenges are going to be had. The 5 levels of information behave similar to, the rules of a game, whereas the communication behaves as the interacting pieces of the game.
Oh, that's it. That's a cool metaphor. So there's like the cards and the board and the rules for the cards, and then I guess there's
yeah. Me and you might have a different interpretation. Yeah, me and you may have a different interpretation of a rule, for example. So that's the information coming in, and then communication. That's how we're going to, exchange. That's basically me and you being game pieces within the game, because we're trying to interpret the rules, and now we're going to have an exchange like those game pieces do to figure out whose interpretation is right. Do you want to tag people before we start going too heavy into it?
What's that?
Should we only have one person. Should we go ahead and tag people before we get too far into it?
Sure.
Let's do that.
And make sure that we have that everybody can hear us okay.
Yeah. So right now we have one in here. Can the one in here verify you can hear Tom? Tom, do you want to do a tester?
Hello. I can hear echoing from your machine, so I presume it's going through okay.
Nice. Okay. And I'm going to invite here. So all right. So we're inviting people as people come in, we're inviting in, we're getting into what we're talking about, the relationship between the levels of information, 5 levels of information, and communication. How communication skills work together with levels of information, and why we have such communication inefficiency right now. We have
one thing that I thought of today, once you lay out for us the 5 levels, and sort of give us a framework to discuss communication in that better way. We talk a lot about disagreements in the forum, but I'd rather use a different subject to use the language. I have a different subject in mind before we get into all that, right?
Okay. Do you want to go over that now, or just at the time?
No. Well, first let's develop the language, because that's what. I'm not that familiar with what you have to present.
Okay, yeah. So let's hit that now. Do you want to hit that now?
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, lowest level of information is statistics. Everything is, of course, information. It's data collection. Me and you get hit by data constantly, right? We're data consuming machines as humans, and we're getting hit by more data now than we ever have been. But that doesn't necessarily matter as much, because we're filtering out the stuff that doesn't matter, because not everything is necessary information. Statistics is random information. It's as if you're throwing Scrabble letters down and randomly and pretending that that's going to tell you anything. It's not. But what you discern from statistics can start to tell you something. Now that's at the higher levels of information. So basically statistics is nothing more than if you give a dog a typewriter and the dog just pangs his paws on the typewriter. Let's just use that metaphor.
So letters, basically.
Yeah.
I think of that as like a signal.
Yeah.
If we're talking about messaging, the statistics is just the voltage changing on the wire or the radio signal or whatever.
Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly it. So if you were to just put out any random ass signal with no objective whatsoever, that would be, basically that first level. Second level, there's some dispute on the name. It's either cosyntax or syntax. I'm running into both, but basically, random sequences. It's like, I love, what's that guy, Brick from Anchorman? I love lamp. It's a level kind of even lower than that. It's basically, there's no sequencing whatsoever to the words, but they're actually put into form that make a word. Not even necessarily a word, just like combinations like XCY space, XCY, BKAL space. These. So basically, you're able to start finding some patterns, but there's nothing that it's necessarily communicating.
Gotcha. So maybe we recognize letters, but we haven't got the words yet.
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah. Basically, if you're going to try to hide communication, you might drop your information level down, perceptually wise to syntax, but you're actually hiding a level of language within that syntax. So you're going to actually form languages from syntax, but syntax itself isn't necessarily any information until someone does something with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Like it's just symbols. If you don't read a book, nobody gets any ideas from it. It just sits there.
Yeah. And that information doesn't necessarily become information until it is perceived as information. And thus syntax can sit there as nothing, but the minute it becomes information, actually goes to a higher level. We can actually go to that, semantics. So the next level of information is semantics. You're going to put words in their proper order. And you might even play definition games here at times. But
so this is the words.
Yeah, this is when you start to take syntax from something XCY and create patterns that communicate something. However,
is this we'd say signifiers?
I would say the next level, but that could be discussed. That could be because the next level is pragmatics, and signifiers matter significantly on pragmatics, because when you get to pragmatics, now you go from semantics. So if I were, and I'm just going to use a fun example, if you're saying let's eat grandpa, in semantics, and you don't have you wouldn't have a signifier in that. You would just have words in order. Let's eat grandpa. But me and you as humans who can discern, and we have that capability, we know let's eat grandpa in order in that way with no signifiers. That would actually mean we're Jeffrey fucking Dahmer. And because we're not Jeffrey fucking Dahmer, we use pragmatics, which have signifiers. And so we now say, let's eat, grandpa. And we turn that semantic, word in order into an actual request. This is a very high level of information. We've never received this kind of information from anything other than intelligence. And you have pragmatics, because what you're doing here is you're taking effectively all of the first three, statistics, syntax, and semantics, and you're discerning some meaning from it. You're ordering it together, adding symbolization on your own to make it communicate in a different way. So this is where you're going to get the first level of really discernment, meaning, inference happening here. And then the next level, go ahead.
can I say this is where we go from like the media to the message? And maybe, you know what? Like that's a better set of words. Am I correct in that sort of distinction?
I would say media to the message is a great way to put it. So, right, and this is actually, and we'll go further into this later, but basically this is where you're going to get some conditioning happening, because the media will portray 1 through 3 as numbers 4 and 5, and they'll do it in ways that are against one another. So, thus,
well, hold on. Before we start talking about the connections, what's the fifth one?
Yeah, apobetics. So APOBETICS. Now, this is the absolute highest level of information. This is not just like request level. So no longer are you saying, let's eat grandpa like you're Jeffrey Dahmer. And no longer are you even saying, let's eat comma grandpa as a request with no intent. You have actually gotten to a point of discernment at apobetics where when you make a request, there is a high level of expectation that that request is going to be met. So this is the highest level of information. Let's just say that this is a programmer code who knows that Mario's hat's going to be red when he makes the first Mario Brothers. This is, you can have the expectation based on the input, based on the discernment, that the feedback, the response is going to be exactly what you are requesting it to be.
So just to talk in another funky language, we kind of hit on this before. We can talk about like the kinds of mistakes that happen when people mess up one of these levels.
Yeah, this is go ahead.
Like the semantics, that's a really common thing for people to try and make an argument out of words and focus on this part of the message. When really, we're trying to talk down here, man. We're not like you're getting caught up in the words, and the message gets away.
That's exactly right. Well, and this is probably today's age where we're finding the most communication gap. So basically, and we see this a lot in the group. You'll have one person post something with a particular meaning. Another person will come in and try to alter what that initial meaning was. And then they'll start fighting on the semantics of certain words that would basically make their case that their meaning is the proper meaning. But no longer are we even talking about what the subject matter was. Does that make sense? So it becomes a circular conversation about who has the proper interpretation of specific words instead of what the original content was.
Right. So someone down here might say, that liberal Trump just pisses me off. The guy says, wait, what? No. He's not liberal. He's libertarian. And then of course the third person is like, no, he's not libertarian at all. No matter how you define that word, like.
That's exactly right. You effectively. This is a great example. Let's use libertarian. Might be one of the best possible examples because that ideology. I consider myself a constitutional libertarian. However, I don't even know what libertarian necessarily is anymore because of the fact that everyone has their own layers of interpretation on top of it to fit themselves. What they're doing is they're finding what matches them the closest and then just kind of fudging it a little bit to match them in instead of just looking at it.
So let me ask you something. I have this pet peeve. This drives me crazy. Someone will come along and pick some noun, I don't even know which one, and they'll throw an ism on the end of it.
Such as Trumpism.
Atheism, not having a belief isn't a system of thought. People call it atheism.
Yeah, for sure.
People that will throw this ism word on the back of anything, and it's weird. It's like using semantics to sneak in a meaning without actually making it explicit.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, basically, you're basically talking about like taking a word and taking the meaning and then just manipulating it into almost like an ideology or cult itself. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I think Apple's computers are, this generation is a lot faster than last year's. Oh, you're some kind of Appleist. I'm a what?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so what would you define that strategy as? Because I would call that a low-level strategy for communication. What would you define that strategy, or what would you kind of call that?
That kind of word, like throwing an ism on the end, that just sort of smears words out. Sometimes you can throw like adjectives on words that just sort of smears them out. And then there's some words that you just like, it's almost like words like that, like ism or deserve is a really good one, or exploit. Like there's all this meaning sort of packed into these words, but if you actually go look at the semantics, it doesn't exist. So it's almost like this, it's like the opposite of a weasel word. A weasel word is a word that sucks the meaning out. And then there's these other words that sort of have meaning stuffed into them in a way that you can't talk about them.
Yeah.
And it's almost, another thing you'll see that's similar is when people use adjectives to sort of cram an evaluation into a thing without actually making the evaluation explicit.
Yeah.
By sort of cramming it, like exploit is a great example. When you say, that I'm against exploitation. Well, yeah, that's great. So well, hold
on. That is, yeah, you're going to the point I'm about to make. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you make it.
Well, I was just going to say, start with what you mean, because clearly, as long as you get a paycheck, you're okay with exploitation, because obviously you're willing to exploit yourself for a certain amount of funds. Because you're always, in other words, the definition, the word origins matter in that sense. And so I'm against exploitation as taking a broad concept and using it manipulatively to try to get what I would call, you're always going to find general agreement when you say something that's a vague word broadly, but that doesn't mean fucking anything ultimately.
That's right. Who doesn't believe in the American dream? Yeah, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, it's modeling political talk. I disagree with exploitation. Fucking awesome. What does that mean? How do you disagree with exploitation and call yourself an employee? You have to discuss entirely what you mean by you don't agree with exploitation from human trafficking. Well, of course. I think you won't find anyone who disagrees with you there that has a humanity soul within them.
But is it exploitation to raise your prices when the supply is low?
And that's exactly it. That's why it matters what you're talking about when you're talking about exploitation. And so this is the examples as you're giving and as we give in these moments, as we go back and forth almost as example, this is where everyone gets caught up on level 3 of information. Semantics, constantly. It's a fucking, what is it? What are those things? Merry-go-round. It's a merry-go-round of ineffective communication.
Well, if you're using sneaky words, then you're using like either clever things to cram a meaning in, or sneaky words to remove meaning. Like you know what justice is, right?
Yeah.
Justice is one of these words it's pretty hard to define. But if you make it social justice, now it's that.
Yeah, impossible to define.
We believe in social markets. Social is one of these words that sucks words out of it.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It's the evaporator of communication.
All right, so that's sort of the kind of thing where we're talking about the words themselves affecting meaning in a hard to talk about way. What are some other kind of errors that you can talk about?
I would say another commonly practiced error is when people will get caught up on inconsequential details on levels 1 and 2. So inconsequential, and I don't mean inconsequential necessarily to their perspective, but basically they're grabbing onto something that's not relevant to the discussion. So a great example is a spelling error. Someone will get caught up on a spelling error, grammatical error, to avoid discussing the actual topic at large. We're all guilty.
Yeah, or the AIDS thing. You're using your words wrong.
Yeah.
I can't follow your argument because you're using your words wrong. No, I'm not. You can't actually use your. I mean, like semantics is an agreement. It's not it's not the universe making us pick these meanings.
That's exactly right. Because if that were the case, we wouldn't have a difference in dictionaries. We wouldn't have an urban dictionary online. We wouldn't have Hebrew text. We wouldn't have hieroglyphics. Communication or semantics is the agreement on how to use words and symbols to communicate. But it's not the message itself.
No, one of the things that excuse me, we might talk about is slang, the way that semantics comes to change to mean different things and what is allowed. Although I don't think there's a whole lot to go into there. So here's what I had in mind that we might use this framework to talk about, and that's how do jokes work?
Yeah, well, and we can use jokes and stories maybe, because those are two of the most effective ways of communication.